Hello, welcome again to the course Life of Christ. We've now finished the Sermon on the Mount, and we want to spend a little bit of time with some of the parables of Jesus beginning in this class. This two-part class is based on Luke 15, so if you can turn in your Bibles to that chapter, we'll begin there. First of all, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background with how Jewish rabbis worked with parables, and just a little bit of knowledge will help us understand how parables function. In Jewish teaching, there are usually considered to be three different kinds of teaching. One is called halakha. It's H-A-L-A-K-A-H. H-A-L-A-K-A-H. And this has to do with just laws, passages that say do this or don't do this, just straight laws. The second kind is called Haggadah. That's spelled H-A-G-G-A-D-A-H. H-A-G-G-A-D-A-H. And Haggadah has to do with telling about the laws, explaining the laws using different methods. Okay, so they give you the law and then they say, okay, here's what it means and here's how to apply it. And then the third kind of teaching is parables, which was also a way that the rabbis used to explain the laws. It was, in some sense, a kind of Haggadah. Now, they would say if a teaching or command, one of the laws, is like a basket full of things we need to know or to do, then parables would be the handles on the basket. In other words, they would help us pick up the basket in order to know how to obey God's law. And usually they use parables in pairs, perhaps because Jewish law required 2 or 3 witnesses to prove a point or to confirm, say, some event or some crime, for example. Perhaps for this reason they would tell parables in twos. And often we see Jesus telling parables in at least 2s, or maybe sometimes, like in this case, even 3 parables. And then as you look through the Gospels, there's different kinds of parables. There's a lot that have to do with a king and a kingdom, and often Jesus used those to refer to the kingdom of heaven. You'd have parables about landowners and labor of some kind, and you recognize that category as well from some we know in the scriptures. There's many parables about money and how to handle it. There's parables about the wise and foolish man or woman. There's parables about family and household, and then loving God and loving your neighbor. Those are the main categories of parables that you would find in Jewish law and teaching. Now, also, if you look back at just the whole body of Jewish teaching in general for hundreds of years, these are also the major categories there. And when you look at Jesus' parables, they reflect to a large degree the percentage of kinds of parables that he used in his teaching as compared to the percentages used in Jewish teaching as a whole, which just underlines the fact that Jesus is a Jewish rabbi. And he followed many of the categories that were known categories at that time because people understood those. Now, there's some other characteristics of parables that we can mention briefly, and again, we don't have to spend a long time on this. Usually they're concise, pretty short. Number 2, they're told from one perspective of a certain man or woman or person from outside the parable. They're presented to the reader by showing and not necessarily telling directly. They don't say, this is the exact answer you're looking for. They tell a story and sometimes let you deduce from the story or infer from the story what you think the message is. And Jesus is really good at that. Sometimes people call that overhearing the gospel. It's almost as if you're not there exactly listening to a person talk to you directly. You overhear the message as a parable is told. 4, there's little interest in motivation. Usually motivation of people in parables is described only when it's essential to the story. 5, there's often no conclusion to it. In other words, you're left to draw your own in many cases, and we'll see that with one of the parables we look at today. It tells the bare bones of the story, the bare minimum of an event. It also is usually direct speech and soliloquy or just discourse. There's often a repetition of phrases, which helps you establish and remember the parable. And often the last line is put last in the parable, and we'll see that many times with Jesus' teachings, especially in parables. And then those of Jesus involve the hearer when he was teaching, or the reader as the gospel writers present his parables. As you look at the gospels, this graphic tells you about what parables are found in which gospels. It's striking that John has no parables, and Luke has the most parables, and then some are repeated in all of them. So if you'd like to pause the video on this screen to look at it longer, or maybe even take a screenshot to look at it later, this is a useful graphic to have to study. Now let's go to Luke 15 and kind of set up this parable. Let's read, first of all, verses 1 through 7. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep." I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who did not need to repent. Now, this chapter starts out with an accusation in verse 2 that this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And again, you look at who Jesus associated with in the Gospels, and this is a true accusation. He does welcome them. This is almost suggesting that Jesus is the host at a dinner in a home, for example, and that he is welcoming sinners. Usually when you welcome people into your home, it meant that you approved of these people and that you approved of what they did, that you were in agreement with them. And so you can see how the Pharisees might be confused. If Jesus is a host and welcomes these people, they would think, does that mean that he approves of everything they do? And of course he doesn't, but he had to welcome the sinners first to be able to teach them and be with them. So usually the custom was for a host to welcome his guest and compliment them in some way, like saying, "You honor my home in coming to visit and share this meal." And you would think, wow, these people honor his home? If they're the worst sinners in town, you can see how the Pharisees would raise their eyebrows at that. And then the guests would respond and ask that God bless the host, or say that it's an honor for them to be there. And so Jesus is faced with his accusation. And instead of saying, "No, let me tell you what I think about these people," or "Let me justify these people in some way," he says, "Well, let me tell you some stories." And so the rest of the chapter is 3 stories, maybe 4, depending on how you count the last parable, about how God feels about these sinners that he's welcoming. Now, in this story we've already read, one of the questions is, who are the lost sheep, or who is the lost sheep that's mentioned? And our first response is, well, it's, probably the sinners Jesus is with. And that's a good answer, probably. But I'm thinking that Jesus is inviting the Pharisees to see themselves perhaps in this category too. If they just stopped and thought about it, really nobody is healthy. Everybody needs the doctor that Jesus has come to be. They're all sick. They're all sinners. And yet the Pharisees are pointing to this other group as sinners. And then the other question is, who's the shepherd? And again, the first answer we'd say is Jesus, because he is the good shepherd. That's how he presents himself in John 10. And we would be right if we said that. There's only one detail in this story that suggests that maybe the shepherds he mentions are the Pharisees. And you think, well, they weren't good shepherds. And that's right, because what does this shepherd have happen to him? This shepherd loses a sheep. And if you're a good shepherd, you don't lose sheep that way. When Jesus talks about himself as a shepherd, one of the things he says is, it's my Father's will that I lose none of the ones that he has given to me. And so the good shepherd doesn't want to lose a single one. And so perhaps Jesus is suggesting the religious leaders are the shepherds and not very good ones. And perhaps this calls to mind Ezekiel 34, 1 through 6, and really more of the whole chapter, when it talks about the religious leaders as bad shepherds in that context in Israel, and then God as a good shepherd. And God refers to himself later in another story and also connects that to Ezekiel. And so if they are indeed the shepherds, then they've lost the sheep. And that's in essence what's happened. These sinners are being ignored by the leaders who are in charge of their spiritual welfare, and they're not going after the sheep. In fact, they're condemning the sheep and letting them stay lost. So that's an interesting take on it. We always read this thinking about the lost sheep or the lost shepherd, or the shepherd as Jesus. And it may be, but it may be more that they're the Pharisees. Okay, so here is something else interesting that really impacts how we understand the key point of the story, and that is the linguistic structure of how Luke writes this and puts this story together on the page. There's a kind of structure called chiastic structure, and it's spelled Chiastic, chiastic. And it comes from the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, or chi, sometimes it's said, and it's actually in the shape of an X, okay? And so what they do is they basically take about half of the X, so it looks like the point of an arrow almost. And so you can diagram out a parable or a story in a chiastic fashion. That's what Luke has written this story to be, in a chiastic structure. And in this structure, you have the first line that in some way in content usually parallels the last line. Okay, so in this case, you'd have, one of you has 100 sheep. Let me just go ahead and set these out here. Okay, and then it says, and loses. Okay, so the parallel to the 100 sheep, it doesn't really have the last line. And sometimes, again, the last line is not said in a story, or it's left to be inferred. And so the parallel to this A line here would be A1, which is maybe he's suggesting the shepherd in heaven is rejoicing over the restored sheep and the flock. That's suggested as a parallel. But then look at the rest of here. B as in loses one of them, and then B apostrophe, or B1 we might say, says over one sinner who repents. So you have losing, and then you have regaining. And then C, you have, does he not leave the 99 in the open country? And you have down here in C apostrophe 99 righteous who do not need to repent. Okay, so again, that's the parallel. D, go after the lost sheep. And again, that was lost, so the idea of lost parallels. Then you have E, until he finds it. And when he finds it, and you have that parallel to I have found my sheep. Then F, he puts it on his shoulders joyfully. And then F apostrophe parallels with rejoice with me, again, the joy. And then you get to the center of the parable. And here's where you almost have the center of the arrow point, okay? And in the core of the story, what happens is that he goes home and he calls his friends and neighbors together. And then he says, let's have a party, okay? And so the idea of the story is what happens when you have lost sinners who repent, lost sheep who come home. Well, the idea is you get together with your friends and neighbors and you have a party. That's the core of the story. And so part of the answer Jesus begins to give to the Pharisees here is, you guys have your attitude all wrong. Instead of condemning these sinners, you should be going after them. And when you find them, rejoice, which is at the core of this story. Okay? Now, in this story, there are two moments of joy. First of all, when the shepherd finds the sheep. Now, I'm not a shepherd and I don't know this, but I understand from what I've studied that when a sheep is lost, it finally gives up and refuses to move. It just lays down and lays there and waits to die or get killed. And so when the shepherd finds the sheep, it can't just say, like you might say to a dog, here, come here, get up, let's go. You have to go over and pick it up and then put it on your shoulders and then carry it home. And then as you carry it home and you put it with the other sheep, then it kind of revives and recovers and then begins to walk around on its own again. And so what that means for the shepherd is this is work. Suppose that he's had to travel a long distance and maybe up and down through hills and maybe difficult terrain, and he gets to this sheep and he realizes, I'm going to have to carry this sheep all the way home. And yet it says he rejoices because he's found the sheep. Even though it means work for him, it's worth it because he's found the sheep. And then the second moment of joy comes when he arrives home And there's joy from the neighbors as they realize he is safe and the sheep is safe as well. And so they begin to have a party because everyone is safe again. Now, just a moment about this culture here. Usually a family wouldn't have 100 sheep unless you're a really rich family. And so usually a family might have 3 sheep, 5 sheep, 8 sheep, 10 sheep. And so this 100 sheep represents probably the flock of the whole village. And so this shepherd is responsible for part of the livelihood of the entire village. And what's more, the people in the village may not hear all the news, and so they don't know whose sheep is lost. So if you have 3 sheep and the lost sheep is one of yours, you're missing a third of what you own there, and so you're naturally concerned. This also explains the reason for the party, because everybody's glad that nobody has lost anything, and of course they're glad they themselves didn't lose anything. Now, one other point that's interesting on this story is where the shepherd leaves the sheep. For a long time I read this story, and I kind of had in my mind when he finds out a sheep is missing, then he goes and he puts everybody else, all the other sheep in the fold, and he closes the gate, and then they're all safe. Then he goes off and he tries to find the sheep. But it says here in the story, it says, doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and then goes after the lost sheep until he finds it? Now think about that just for a minute. If a sheep can be lost or attacked or killed, just one sheep, then when the shepherd goes off and leaves the 99, he's putting all of them at risk. Others could wander off. Others could be killed by predators. And so by going off after the one sheep, the shepherd is telling you, this is how important I think every single sheep is. It's not enough just to have 99 out of 100. It's a great percentage, but it's not enough for the shepherd. The shepherd wants 100%, and he doesn't want just any old sheep. He wants that particular sheep that was lost because he knows that sheep, and that sheep knows him. So really it tells you a lot about the pastor, about the shepherd, and the priorities of that. I began to understand this story in a whole different light when I had something happen to me when I was a missionary in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'd gone downtown with my kids to pay some bills and run some errands, and it's a huge city, like 16 million people, and large public transportation system. So we finished paying the bills, and we were getting ready to go home, and I had my daughter, Allison, on one side, kind of had her by the hand, and or she would grab my pocket. She was about 7 years old. And then I had my son, Daniel, about 2 or 3, in the stroller in front of me, and I was pushing him along, and then I'd carry him down the steps to the subway. So we get to the subway, and I've got Daniel, in my hands, and I've carried the little stroller down the steps, and I get to the bottom, and I set the stroller down, and right as I do that, the subway arrives. And you have to understand that, when subways arrive, they don't wait long. The doors are open. That might be open 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and you got to get on or else the subway will leave quickly. And so we got down there, and I thought, great, the subway's right here. And so, I had Daniel here, and Allison, I thought, was at my pocket. And so I run onto the subway, and the door's closed, and the subway starts to move. And I look down for Allison, and she's not there. And I look on the other side, and she's not there. And I look behind me, and I see Allison still on the platform through the doors. And she's looking at me, and I'm looking at her. She had stopped to give a coin to a lady that was begging at the bottom of the stairs. And in the rush, I hadn't realized she'd let go of my pocket. And I began just to absolutely panic. I thought of those movies, where you yell at the conductor and the conductor stops the train. No conductor. Then I thought, well, sometimes, they grab the brake cable up by the windows and they yank on it and they stop the whole train. I didn't care if I was going to stop the whole train and make everybody late. I had my little girl out on the platform, 7 years old, by herself, and we were leaving her, and there was no cable. And I couldn't stop the subway. And the subway pulled out, and I was trying to tell her, stay there, and I'm sure the people thought I was just crazy. And the subway pulled out of the station, and the last thing I heard was Allison wailing as she was left behind. It kills me even now just to think about it. And I remember looking down the tunnel, just a dark tunnel all the way to the next station, and thinking that's kind of like the rest of my life, because I've lost our daughter. And what am I going to tell my wife? I just felt it's like a terrible dream that I couldn't wake up from. And so it only took probably about 30 seconds or a minute to get to the next station but it seemed like years. And then we finally got to that station, and I ran off, and I waited for the next subway, and that took several more years. And then we finally caught the subway going back to the first station. That took several more years. And so by that time, I was just sure that Allison had run away up the stairs, maybe fallen on the tracks, maybe somebody had taken her and gone away. I was just panicking. And so we pull into the station. I'm looking through the windows at the station to see if she's there. And sure enough, she's there. A lady had seen what had happened, and she kind of stayed with her and even offered to take her home. But Allison said, no, my daddy will come back. And so the doors open, and I run off to hug Allison, almost left Daniel on the subway in the stroller because I was so glad to see Allison. And I hugged her, and I was just so glad. I thought about maybe 3 or 4 minutes in all, but it seemed like forever. And what could have just made the rest of my life have that tragedy in it, the rest of my life had been averted. And I was so grateful to have the sheep back. And as I was thinking, on the way home, I remembered this story. And all of a sudden I understood, okay, that's what the heart of the Father is really like. Because if somebody had come up to me and said, well, you have a son still, and you and your wife are young, you can have more kids and more daughters, I probably would have punched him in the face because I didn't want to hear about more kids. I wanted that daughter because she's my daughter. And I've always remembered that story and this parable. And I thought, that's how much God wants a sheep to come back when they've gone away from him. And that really is a powerful story. You understand why there's so much joy at the center of the story, right? Why there's rejoicing over the lost one instead of the 99 that didn't get lost. And you kind of wonder, how they celebrated. I even had kind of a strange thought one time. What if they go home and they celebrate and they want to have like a barbecue, so they kill a sheep to celebrate? I thought, surely not. No, they wouldn't do that. They just got a sheep back, right? But when you think about sometimes how we act in church, when somebody is a member of the church and then they fall away, maybe they sin, maybe they just get disinterested, maybe something happens in their family and they leave, then what do? Do we feel the heart of the Father and say, that person is just as important as everybody else? It's a precious child of God. We need to go after that. Or do we say, well, they were stupid. I saw that coming. They were not very faithful, and they didn't really come very much, and they made mistakes. They were caught up in some sins, and man, I just knew that was going to happen to them, and criticize from a distance and not go after the person. Unfortunately, I think we've done that a lot in the church as well. But suppose that maybe somebody goes after that person, even if they've messed up, and then they decide to come back, and then that person arrives back at the church on the first Sunday, and then after they get back, then people say, oh, I'm so glad to see you, and they give them a hug and they welcome them back. But then sometimes what happens is we begin to talk about the person behind their back. Well, they're back, but man, I don't know for how long. I wonder if they're going to do the same thing again. That was really stupid what they did. Or maybe we talk to the person directly and say, how could you have done what you did? Didn't we tell you not to do that? We told you to do better. And we begin to criticize, almost as if we are killing that sheep by criticism and maybe by neglect as well. And so I want to give us a little challenge that when we lose people from church, it may not even be our fault. It may be entirely their fault, but it doesn't matter whose fault. What matters is there's a sheep getting lost. And if we understand the heart of the Father, like we would understand with our own kids, then we can't stand the idea that somebody would go away and nobody would even look. I'm sure that not all the stories of shepherds ended this well. Sometimes the sheep were killed or never found or fell off a cliff. But we got to go. We've got to go look. And even though it may take time, and maybe certain sheep have a tendency to wander off, the same sheep over and over, and we get frustrated and irritated and tired of it, and yet that's still a valuable sheep to the shepherd. And so I guess I'm talking to myself and also to us in the church. If we're in a church, we need to go after the sheep, and maybe as many times as it needs to happen. Try to get help from the Lord to do that. All right, now let's go to the next story, and I've kind of left my notes here. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention before we go on is the connection to the previous story in Luke 14. Now, because we have chapter division, sometimes we don't look and see how stories are connected from chapter to chapter. But if you look at the last part of Luke 14, it's about counting the cost. And Jesus warns people to count the cost before they decide to follow him. He talks about building a tower or going to war. And he says there, if you don't have enough money or men to do the tower or the war, then don't build the tower and don't go to war. And then the analogy is, and so you have to count the cost to follow me. Almost as if he's saying, well, so if you count the cost and it's too high, then just don't follow me. I don't care. But we know that's not how God feels. He wants everyone to follow him. He knows not everyone will, but he wants everyone to do it, but just to count the cost beforehand. And so I wonder if when Jesus gives that challenge to people, I wonder if Luke puts these stories back to back, goes from counting the cost and how difficult it is to follow Jesus to saying, but if you do follow Jesus, then this is the kind of shepherd Jesus is going to be for you. If you count the cost and then something happens and you get lost or you get in trouble, Jesus will come after you because he's that kind of shepherd. And the Father, later on in the parable, the Father is that kind of Father who will love you and take you back. I think there's a connection between chapter 14 and 15. All right, let's go on to the next parable, the parable of the lost coin in verses 8 through 10. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. A lot more simple story here. And again, I want to point out the structure. Look at this parallel structure here. You have the woman with 10 silver coins, and the angels of God have all the sinners back together, parallel. Loses one, that I lost. Lights a lamp and searches, and then see, she finds it. Okay, so lost and found. And then what is again at the core of the story in this chiastic structure? It's the joy at finding what's lost. And again, they call the friends and neighbors together and have a party. So now, two parables Jesus has told in response to this accusation of the Pharisees, and at both times the response is, this is how God feels about things that are lost when they're found again. Now, let me show you one other detail here that kind of became a little bit clearer to me. You're looking down, you're standing in the middle of a church in Capernaum right now, okay? And it's a church that's actually built over the house, or what they think is the house, of the Apostle Peter and his mother-in-law, okay? And so we're standing in the middle of the church looking down into the house. And if tradition is right, church tradition is right, then Jesus and Peter's mother-in-law would have spent many nights probably in this house, because Jesus had nowhere to lay his head, probably didn't have his own home. And so it's very likely that he was in this house quite a bit, eating supper, sleeping, teaching. We know that he was here in Mark 1, for example, healing Peter's mother-in-law and then healing everybody that came to the door of the house. I want you to notice something about the floor of this house. You see that it's not a smooth concrete floor or like a wooden floor like we're used to, because if I'm in my kitchen and I drop a quarter on the floor, I can just look on the floor and find my quarter. It's easy, right? Because the floor is smooth and it's obvious where the quarter is. But with this floor, what happens if you drop a coin? It's not just on a flat dirt floor or concrete floor. It probably falls down among the cracks between all these stones on the floor. So you can see how she would have trouble to find it, and why she has to get a lamp and light it, and then get a broom and sweep between the rocks, between every crack, to dig that coin out from between the rocks. I think that shows us maybe what some of the floors of the houses would have been like, and this story makes more sense, why it's so difficult to find the coin, and why she's so glad when she finally finds it. Now, the difference between this parable and the first one is that the coin is a possession, not a living thing that can decide a little bit for itself. And this coin may be important because it might be part of her dowry. where she needs 10 coins at least in order to make a wedding present to the family whose son is going to marry her. And if she has only 9, that might not be enough, and she might not be able to get married. It could have also been part of a necklace, which would have 10 coins. And so the idea would be that if you only have 9, it's an incomplete necklace, and so imperfect, kind of like if you're missing a tooth up front, then it's not a full set of teeth. And that might have also lessened the value of the other 9 coins. And so it's important to have all 10. Even though 9 out of 10 is a good percentage, we want all 10. And then when you get to the end of this story, it talks about there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God. You think, okay, the angels are there, right? But it's in the presence of the angels. So even though the angels may be celebrating too, somebody else is rejoicing in their presence. And the answer is God is rejoicing. He's got all his angels all around him, and God is in the middle of the angels rejoicing with the angels about one sinner who repents. So again, these first 2 parables tell us a lot about God's attitude toward lost people that are found, that repent and come back. Okay, so that's the first part of this lesson on parables. We'll come back with the second part and look at the story of the prodigal son and the older brother. See you next time.